This is a story woven from an ancient thread. It is a thread from the northern Eurasian cultures, going back at least 5,000 years, probably 15 or 20,000 years, back to the last ice age when most of the northern hemisphere had a climate like the Arctic. Back to when humans were scarce and there were large thundering herds of reindeer over much of the northern clime. The Deer Mother. Long, long ago, but not so very far away, it was a time of darkness and of cold, and was getting darker and colder. Oh, there was still spring and summer, if you could call it that, and autumn too, but the winters got longer and longer and colder and colder. Snow and ice covered most of the land most of the time, and the sun got a little farther away each year. The people suffered from the cold, and they grew hungry as many of the plants and animals they depended upon grew scarce, and many died of hunger. They suffered also from fear. They began to fear that the sun might not return at all, and they would all starve. Fortunately, the reindeer nation grew strong. They liked the cold and knew how to survive eating bark and lichen in the winter. As the herds grew, the people looked to the deer for food, tools from their antlers and bones, clothing from their hides, as well as shelter. The people came to revere the reindeer and followed wherever they went. The deer nation was led by the female deer. They were both larger than the male deer and kept their antlers through the winter until their calves were born in the spring. The male deer dropped their antlers right after mating season. The females led the herds. They knew where the best bark and lichen could be found. It was always a female deer that led the herds to the spring birthing grounds and summer pasture. The people followed the herds and looked to their ways. Nevertheless, it continued to get colder and darker, and the people's fear grew and grew. One winter it was so cold and dark they were sure the sun would not return. And so on the longest night of the year, the people prayed in earnest. They built a huge bonfire, sang songs of praise to the sun, begging for his return. They asked for help from all their relations, from the trees and the four-legged ones, the winged ones, the creeping, crawling ones, and last but not least, they called upon the deer for help. Suddenly, in the midst of the frantic drumming, wailing, and praying, a deer appeared, alone, out of the darkness, her enormous antlers gleaming in the firelight. As she walked slowly around the circle of the bonfire, the people fell silent. When she came to the east, she nodded her head as if to say, "I will help you if I can." Then the deer headed off at a gallop. As she reached the crest of the hill, she leapt into the air, and the people let out a loud gasp as she flew off into the night sky. The reindeer flew out over the forest, over mountains, rivers, and streams. She flew high up over more forests and mountains, and over the frozen tundra, on and on and on, until finally she came to the place of the sun. She bowed down and silently begged the sun to return so the people would not perish. The sun saw her exhaustion and her bravery and took pity upon the people. The deer drank from a nearby stream, rested for a moment, and then bowed down even lower as the sun came up onto her enormous antlers, and they set off. She leapt up into the air again and flew back over frozen tundra, rivers, mountains, and forests, on and on and on through the long night. Now the people had nearly given up and fell into a troubled sleep near dawn. Not long after that, a little child woke and peeked out toward the east. The child's eyes grew wide, and she woke up everyone to come see. There on the crest of the hill was the deer, and shining in her enormous antlers was the sun. And it was a little bigger and brighter. A cry went up, and all raised their voices in unison. The deer mother has returned with the sun. For thousands of years, millennia, the people honored the deer mother, especially on the longest night of the year. They sang of her bravery and her perseverance, and they never feared again for the return of the sun. Her antlers, which carried the sun, came to be depicted as the tree of life, covered in vines, flowers, and especially birds. For thousands of years, women were the shamans, the healers, the life-givers, and they wore antlers on their headdresses. There are indigenous Eurasian peoples who still have similar practices today. And even now, though disguised in the current dominant culture, the deer mother still appears in many forms and in many ways during the celebrations at the darkest time of the year. There are those of us who have remembered, and we too honor her again. Blessings of winter solstice to you. May you peacefully enjoy the glorious velvety darkness of the longest night of the year.